The motion tabled by my colleague for Timmins James Bay is very important if we want to have real reconciliation with the First Nations in this country. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal made a ruling in July 2016, and it condemned the government for racial discrimination against thousands of First Nations children and their families who wanted to have access to services, but they had insufficient access to those services. This is a problem of unprecedented scope. Even though the government inherited this file, the government is not respecting its legal and moral obligation to end the systematic discrimination that First Nations children are facing. I'll remind you the context of this decision. It started in 2007 when the First Nations Child and Family Support Services, led by Cindy Blackstock, and the First Nations Assembly filed a complaint to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal against the federal government, which is currently led by the Conservatives. A year later, in 2008, the government made a public apology for the forced assimilation of young First Nations children in residential schools. But the same year, they refused to sign the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One step forward, two steps back. This is the approach that we saw with the old government and with the current Liberal government as well, unfortunately. In 2016, in January, the government was called upon to act. They accepted the court's ruling, but they continued to slow down and to drag their feet. And there have been two follow-ups because the Liberals have refused to respect the decision. The Liberal government needs to act now, not in 1 year, not in a month, not in 2 weeks, now. Certainly not in its next term. The government is just playing for time. And this is why the House needs to remind the government that it has a legal obligation to respect the basic principle and its obligation to repair the errors of the past when it comes to First Nations children and to invest $155 million, which is missing for this year in terms of funding for services to children. Now, on the subject of discrimination, I'm going to talk about a reserve which is on my riding. Well, part of it is in my riding, and it's in the southwest of Quebec. And another part of it is in Ontario, and another part is also in the U.S. This is a First Nation that fought for nearly 15 years to receive official recognition for child services. So they got this in 2012 from the provincial government, and with this recognition they were able to take care of local issues themselves rather than by a third party. But it took 15 years to get that recognition. Does that make any sense, Mr. Speaker? I don't think it does. How many children from the Akwesasne nation had to suffer while the government was dragging its feet? I don't know, but even if it was only one family or only one child who was left in a bad situation without access to services because the government was stubbornly arguing over who would be responsible for providing services, well, that's one child too many. It's unacceptable for the Akwesasne First Nation to have had to wait so long for services. That's why it's important to apply Jordan's principle. This principle says that First Nations children need to have access to the same government services as those provided to non-Aboriginal children, and that jurisdictional disputes should not hinder the provision of services to children. Now, this is not the first time we've asked the government to apply Jordan's principle. My former colleague, Jean Crowder, had tabled a motion in the House in 2007 to that effect. It was adopted by the House of Commons, but 9 years later, in 2016, it's very frustrating to see that we haven't moved forward, even though this motion had been adopted. As the critic for youth, I was unpleasantly surprised by the scope of mental health problems that we see among First Nations youth. 50% of them who live reserves have average to high levels of mental distress. Suicide among Inuit youth is responsible for 10% of deaths in that group, and the situation will not get better without long-term investment in the health of Aboriginal youth. Mental health is determined by a complex interaction of socioeconomic factors as well as individual behavior, and that's according to Health Canada. Aboriginal communities are really left behind compared to other populations. According to one expert, many of the health problems are due to the marginalization that Aboriginals have experienced. In fact, this is a multi-generational effect. In fact, if we look at recent studies involving Aboriginals, there were 94 recommendations made by the Commission, which the government decided to accept and to implement. The 150,000 children who went to residential schools are still suffering the consequences. They lost their culture, they were traumatized by violence, and many of them brought back to their communities these problems involving substance abuse and so on. And there are still visible consequences of this today. First Nations children are 12% more likely to be placed into foster homes. Cindy Blackstock says that there are more First Nations children being placed in foster homes today than they were in the time of residential schools for many reasons. The marginalization of Aboriginal communities is not over. It's not in the past. In terms of employment and high school dropout rates, they're far higher among Aboriginals. 5 times more Aboriginals face food insecurity. So now we can start to understand the problems of First Nations. Cindy Blackstock said in an article that
twice.
I hope that the Liberal government will remember her words. To conclude, even if the current situation of First Nations youth is a grim one, there are many services all across the country that are there to help them if we provide the means to do so. The Child and Family Services Association for the Akwesasne Nation has received some services, and they have an institution that came to the reserves to try to understand their situation. So there was a meeting in 2015. And I'm saying this because I believe that we can all help to improve the fate of First Nations children. This is a reality, and it is the duty of the House to remind the government of its obligations, to correct the errors of history, and not to leave another First Nations generation by the wayside. This is why I'm happy to be able to announce the Akwesasne Council's support for this motion. I will be proud to vote in favor of this motion, and I hope that all members of the House will do so as well. If we really want to see reconciliation, and if we really want to improve the fate of all Canadians, we need to think of First Nations, and we need to ensure that the promises that were made in this House during the elections and since the election are really fulfilled and met. I think that First Nations have suffered enough. They've suffered enough discrimination. And it's time to end this era of discrimination. We need to put an end to prejudice and fear between the different populations so that we can have mutual understanding and so that we can finally have healthy relationships between communities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Questions and comments?